if we really, really, really looked at what Dr. King says about it, and I see Betsy shaking their head yes here, I think Dr. King's work would be banned. You know why it's not, though? Because we sugarcoat him. We tend to, you've probably seen all those quotes today about, oh, joining hands and, singing the Coke song, and that's all good. But we want to talk about that other side of what it means to be radical. And to some degree, us having a conversation tonight about banned books is really a way of trying to challenge the status quo. So I want to give you an opportunity to sign that pledge only if you believe in those principles. We don't want anybody's name on there. If you can't value compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, and self-reflection, we don't want your name on it. But if you do, then we'd love to have you part of this movement that we call Humanity 101. Next slide, please. Joining me in this conversation tonight is my dear, dear, dear friend, Cyndee Landrum, whom I've known for, close to 30, a long time, shall we say.
A long time.
Joining us from Chicago, is that correct?
No, I'm actually in South Jersey.
Oh, okay. All right.
Philly area, East Coast.
Okay, still in another cold place. But let me just give you just a snapshot of who Landrum is. Miss Landrum, among other things, and this is really does not do justification to all the wonderful things that she is and does, but I want to highlight just a few of those. Cyndee Landrum has been active in local, state, and national professional associations, including serving as president of the Arizona Library Association, an inaugural member of the Public Library Association Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force, and an executive board member of the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. So that is just a quick snapshot. This is somebody who knows this topic, and we know where the experts are. Okay, but we also know that we invited you as a Vital Voices format for Project Humanities to bring something to share. So if you brought something to share related to banned books, the topic, then please indicate that in the chat so that our team can kind of come up with a list. And those shares are 2 to 3 minutes that have to do with banned books in particular. All right, so if you brought a share, we will sort of guide the conversation, but we really, really, really want to be led by your engagement with team members. So please, please, please engage. And if you brought something to share, let us know, and then we'll call upon you as we move through the conversation tonight. So what excites you about this conversation tonight, Cyndee?
My name's Ashley, and I'm a
Well, this is a hot topic, but for those of us in the library world, it's not a new topic.
Okay.
And it gets discussed and often in our profession quite frequently. So I'm really excited to see it engaged in another setting. I think it's particularly poignant that we're doing this today on Dr. King's birthday, celebration of his birthday, and a day of service, a day on, not a day off. Yes, and so this ignites me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion this evening.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for reminding us that the King Day can be a day of service, and that's why we pledged Project Humanities. And I probably 4 years ago that we would do our service, and we did our service yesterday, our homeless outreach to about 200 unsheltered individuals, and we had 85 volunteers. That's the highest number of volunteers we've had in 9 years of doing this. And it felt good to do that service. But we also know that there's an education piece to Dr. King's work and legacy. And so we vowed under my leadership 4 years ago that in the evening of MLK Day, we would have a program to educate not other people, but to educate ourselves. And for the past 4 years, we have had this format of inviting people to share, but it was also a way of learning. So we've done tributes to Maya Angelou. We did a tribute to Ntozake Shange. Last year, we did joy as a radical act. And tonight just feels like it makes sense that we would talk about banned books, and we'll give you some context for that. All right, so let's get this party started. So let's come up with the next slide, Rachel, and we'll play the first video. We're going to play this first because I like to get an engagement piece. So I want you to see this very short video. And then here's the question that I want to ask. As this video play, how does this get at the root of this issue of banned books? So I'm going to ask my teammate Rachel to play the first video. Video 1. And you in the chat, I want you to tell us, how does this get at the heart of the issue of banned books?
Awesome. Remember we talked about
we should probably get it to play in full screen, shouldn't we? And the downloaded version of that does not want to play in full screen.
Just go ahead and play the version that we have, please.
Okay, sure.
Because people will be able to hear and see.
Okay, perfect.
I like to start with a little engagement here.
Okay. Can you see?
awesome.
Okay, can you turn up the volume, please? Or make sure we get the volume.
We talked about word families. I know you love that. So we're going to start with words that end in AN. You yell out a word, I'll write it down. Let's see how many we can get. Go!
Fan!
Fan! There's a good one. Man, that's another one.
Lesbian.
Words that end in AN. Anyone? Words ending in AN.
Lesbian.
Okay, I heard pan. Good.
No, Faith said lesbian.
All right, no big deal. Faith said lesbian. Hold on. Good, we'll write that down. Just a word, not a big deal, but we'll move on. We'll get some other ones.
What is a lesbian, sir?
What's your word? How do you... All right. If you liked another girl, that could be...
I like Olivia. Am I a lesbian?
Well, if you like Olivia, you could be, sure.
I like Olivia. I love Olivia. I like Olivia too. Am I a lesbian?
No, it doesn't work that way, Philip. You can never be a lesbian.
No fair. I want to be a lesbian. Me too.
We can all be lesbians. Okay, let's just move on. Let's try words that end in O-N.
Prostitution.
What did you say?
Prostitution. What is prostitution?
What is prostitution? Let's say prostitution is when you work in the street and you get paid.
I want to do prostitution.
No. All right. Moving on to words that end in RE, but let me just have a second here to think if nothing, there can't be. So shout out words that end in RE.
Crack whore.
Okay, all right. So get in the chat. I want to see, how does that short skit get at kind of the core of what this book banning about? Let's see what your response is. I'll give you probably, I don't know, 30 seconds to write some responses there to that short little skit. How does that get at the core of what the issue is around banned books? And then Cyndee and I will start this conversation. All right. Okay. All right. I'm seeing some things there. Challenges the viewer to answer difficult questions. Yes. What else? Give me something else. Let's just not talk about it. It won't exist. Yes. Okay. Uncomfortable reading about, showing different people. Banned books supposedly protect kids from knowing. All right. Cyndee, thoughts about that as a way of opening and engaging and beginning our conversation about banned books?
Well, when you look at banned books, the history of banned books.
I'm a librarian.
Yeah.
What is Ashley?
Oops.
Remember we
Yeah,
talked
go ahead.
about word families. I know you love that.
I think we still got video going. So I'm gonna start here. I have my best cardigan on tonight. But I just also want to say that even though I'm wearing my best cardigan, my thoughts don't represent all librarians. We are not a monolith, and so these are my opinions, and they really don't reflect anything but my opinions and thoughts in this area. and none of the associations that I may have and affiliations that I may have. But it's interesting that some of the responses, because if you look at banned books historically, and really, we talk about banned books, and I believe there was a comment that said not just books, but just as long as there have been ideas and people have sought to spread those ideas, there have been people who may not be comfortable with those ideas. Sometimes it's because those ideas challenge a way of thinking that we hold dear, or values that we think maybe values that everyone should have. And so, and yes, they spark some uncomfortable conversations, or conversations that we may not have the capacity to have or know how to have. And so we really want to limit access to that information, sometimes for our own, due to our own discomfort, or our own challenges with having some difficult conversations. So that's one of the reasons, and probably a large reason why this happens. But there are many other reasons why people seek to limit access to or ban books, and we can talk a little bit about the language of banned books.
Yes, we will. Well, it's interesting also that one of the reasons that I selected that, we've used that in a different context when we talk about having difficult conversations with children, is there's something about sex that just seems to make adults, parents, grown-ups uncomfortable. And keep in mind, the focus of this is children, and the children are asking questions. The question becomes, where do they get these ideas from? And people say they get them from a book. Well, I can tell you, in my work on the N-word, no third grader is getting the N-word from a book. Okay, they have gotten that because they have heard that. And there are ways in which books can be used to sort of dispel some of the myths that they might be hearing about people who are, that epithet is thrown at. So there are ways in which this conversation about banned books is really about banning ideas. And what are those ideas that are most banned? And I can tell you, we start up here with this aerial view, and then we sort of filter down, and I want to say with Arizona. So there's a video that we have that is specifically about what's happening here in Arizona that has to do specifically around sex and gender and sexual identity. And that to me is there's a whole list of other things that we also ban. So let's look at video number 3, Rachel. That one, there we go. Yes.
After September 24th, you won't be able to find certain books on school shelves because of a new law that passed in Arizona. Cronkite News reporter Olivia Doles tells us how this bill will affect classrooms in the future.
There are hundreds of books to choose from when you walk into a library, but soon teachers in Arizona may be limited on the books they can select for their classrooms, and education advocates are worried about the chilling effect on students and educators.
Because teachers will worry, like, am I allowed to even teach this book?
House Bill 2495 bans books in classrooms that refer students to sexually explicit material, specifically sexual conduct, sexual excitement, or ultimate sexual acts. With the vague language of the new law, teachers are still uncertain with what can and cannot be taught.
We're very concerned about the impact that this incredibly vague bill language would have on teachers and on students who are trying to access not just new materials that reflect their perspectives, but also materials that have been utilized in classrooms for a long time.
We reached out to Representative Jake Hoffman, who sponsored the bill, but he did not respond to our request for comment. However, he spoke during a hearing on the bill about its importance.
This bill is about protecting kids from sexually explicit material. We need them learning math, reading, writing, and other incredibly important educational materials that will help prepare them for a vibrant and prosperous future, not worrying about sexually explicit material.
But the ban has teachers worried about the consequences if they do assign a book that goes against the law.
I could face being fined, fired, or losing my certification.
And there's fear the ramifications may go beyond the bookshelves, forcing teachers out of the classroom.
Ultimately, what we need to do is trust our teachers and respect them for the professional experts that they are.
In Phoenix, Olivia Doles, Cronkite News.
The law goes into
Let's
effect
take a look at
Saturday.
that
The teachers
visual.
we talked to say they
That
will still
visual
find
that we
books that will
had
keep
of the United States and the book bans by state, and see if you have any comments about that image there. And look at your state, wherever you're joining us from. And this is data that was collected from PEN America Index and from July 1, 2021 to June 2022. Can we ascertain anything just from glancing at that, Cyndee?
Well, well, you know, it's pretty clear, and I'm looking at the where we have, you know, 0 bans. There's a couple things I would say. You know, obviously, we can look at certain states and we could maybe make certain assumptions about political meaning. But I do want to say it's interesting, and I think this is sort of a definitional thing that we should remember is when we talk about book bans, they just, you know, book bans is a really has sort of become sort of a catch-all for a process that, depending on how PEN is defining actual bans. So, you know, do these represent books that actually are no longer available in a classroom, in a library, in a bookstore? Because we could cheer on all the states that have 0 bans, but that doesn't mean that those books have not been challenged in those communities.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the challenge may not have been successful, but it doesn't mean that there are no challenges to books in those communities that we see have zero bans.
Yes, that's what I wanted you to clarify, because these can be misleading, but they can also be indicative of some of the things that are going on in the politics. And this is where, when we talk about, oh, this is such a political conversation, and we see the children at the heart of this, we're wondering, well, what are we protecting children from themselves? I mean, I've heard somebody say something about every banned book is a book that potentially saves someone's life. Every banned book is potentially a book that saves some person's life. So I want to sort of go to the next slide, Rachel, please, and come up with just an operational definition of what we mean by banning and censoring, since you make that distinction there. And this is not a definition I have. It's a popular article out there, Book Banning by Susan L. Webb. And here's how Webb distinguishes. She says, book banning is a form of censorship that occurs when private individuals, government officials, or organizations remove books from libraries, school reading lists, or bookstore shelves because they, the individuals, the group officials, or the organizations, object to their content, their ideas, or themes. And children's literature is the primary target. Now, we know that banning can be in other forms, and we may address those as well. Censorship, on the other hand, is a suppression of ideas, and information can occur at any stage or level of publication, distribution, or institutional control. Some pressure groups claim that public funding of most schools and libraries makes community censorship of their holdings quite legitimate. And I think you were trying to segue into some of that definitional stuff that would be helpful in this conversation. Do you want to add more to that?
Sure. So, you know, I think we have, you know, we think of book banning, we have this image of in our minds, Fahrenheit, you know, 451, and people are throwing books in the fire or the bonfire. And we also have understanding of book bannings around access, meaning the book is not on the shelf somewhere. The definition about censorship is one we don't often talk about because it also relates to other reasons that books may get banned or information may get redacted at the various stages. So, you know, as a measure of national security, there have been publications that have been limited and access to that material at the publication stage is limited, or a book may be published with information that is redacted.
Mhm.
So, you know, there's a lot of different ways that I'm going to use book banning because it's a popular term here,
Mhm.
that a book may be banned or an idea may be censored, and there's variations on the theme of why. But you know, all of this really starts with that first challenge when someone says, hey, at their library, school, wherever, you know, we have a problem or an issue with this particular material, and then moves forward. And sometimes, and there's levels to this. So something may be pulled from a school curriculum, but still remain in the school library. And so, you know, I think when people hear banning, they think, you know, satanic verses, Salman Rushdie, you know, the entire we're not publishing it. It's not, it doesn't exist anywhere. But this is a very accurate description of what these two things are. Just, I would say that there's nuance to
Mhm.
operationalizing it.
Right. Well, and I love in our pre kind of conversation before this, you mentioned a term called censorship by omission.
Mhm.
Censorship by omission. Could you elaborate on that for our virtual audience?
Sure. So, you know, obviously no institution, with the exception of, you know, your National Library or Library of Congress, can actually hold every volume that
Right.
is ever
That's never been done.
published, right? It's just not possible. But you know, we make curatorial choices in institutions, and so sometimes there are decisions made. Years ago, I'm sure you remember the book "The Sex" by Madonna.
Oh, yes.
Many
Yes.
institutions, many
Those of a
libraries
certain age will remember that.
will
Yes.
remind me. I'm probably dating myself, but you know, some places decided not to purchase that book, and it was quite a an uproar. And you know, the logic behind it was, oh well, that book will get stolen, so you know, it's gonna get off, it's gonna make it to the shelf, and then it's gonna find its way
Oh, I see.
out the door, right? And you know, there's probably some truth to that. I can say that there are probably some really high volume theft items in any library. um but that sort of became the source of the decision making to not purchase. But everyone knew that ultimately that book would be very controversial.
Right. Okay. All right. And there are certain topics and categories that seem to rise to the top when we want to censor ideas and ban books. Next slide, please. So here's something again from Pen America, and you can see here with the graph that the most banned books content seems to be around LGBTQ themes. Thus, one of the reasons that our opening videos seemed appropriate, because they were about sexuality and sexuality, trying to talk to children about sexuality. Themes, protagonists, prominent secondary characters. There's also about color, characters of color, about race. That's why I was very curious to say, for those who really, really, really know Dr. King's work, I think if people read the real radical Dr. King, who talked about racism, they probably put him on the ban list too. Okay. Sexual content, titles that have to do with race and racism. Then there are the themes of rights and activism, biographies, memoirs, and then stories with religious minorities. That's kind of a lot. What else is there to talk about? What else is there to talk about? I mean, doesn't this sort of bring up issues that center around diversity? So we see a lot of this is about silencing, erasing minoritized voices. What do you see in, to our virtual audience, what do you see in this sort of this graphic about the banned content? What is there left to talk about? What is there left to talk about? What patterns do you see? Okay. Now, when we move to talk about reasons for banning, let's move to the next slide there. The alleged reasons, and I say alleged because we can't prove them. We just know that people are upset about them. They could be performing upset, or they could be genuinely upset. And I guess the question is, well, is it okay if you're upset? But this notion that they fear that children will be swayed by its potentially dangerous contents, or they fear that these publications will present ideas, raise questions, and incite critical inquiry among children that parents, political groups, or religious organizations are not ready to address, or that they find inappropriate. Not ready to address. Can we tease out that a little bit, Cyndee? Not ready to address.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this has been actually like ongoing. When you look at the previous slide, which is more current, if you look at the rationale for banning books in the past, they've been very similar. You know, particularly once we had the 20th century and you had, you know, some of the works that we would consider classic parts of our canon were
Yes.
considered salacious, you know, I mean, Grapes of Wrath, you know, things, you know, J.D. Salinger, oftentimes
To Kill a Mockingbird.
Kill a Mockingbird, we can go on, and oftentimes so I saw someone said Romeo and Juliet. So all these things
Ray. Yep.
have been part of our canon for such a long time. They were the classics, the things you needed to read in order to be considered a learned person.
Yes.
In their early iterations, they would have been part of these lists. They were challenged, and it often was because, yes, people didn't want to have certain conversations, or the protagonist or the topic pushed against, you know, sort of what was considered the norm at the time, or a traditional value, or, and I use that loosely, or certain values, or, you know, dealt with other issues. We haven't had any pushback around books dealing with mental health, but you know, that period of time, there were books where the characters were characterized and portrayed in a certain way that you know, we didn't talk about things like mental health. And so again, it is the same. People are not ready to address it. They don't know how to address it. And so because I don't want to, and this is where I think it's really interesting, and I think, you know, it's fine if you as a parent are not ready maybe for your child to read that. The challenge is when you don't want other people's children to read it, which is largely because there's another level of exposure that can take place.
Yes.
Yeah. So
well, and that's interesting. If you could pull the slide back up, Rachel, because I'm really interested in the language that's being used, because it seems to be language when we say graphic violence. What is graphic violence? And then what is something that's potentially dangerous? And what is something that is explicit? Those are not necessarily objective, definite things that we can define, because that's relative to individuals, though. What's offensive language? To whom is it offensive? Why is it offensive? It's unsuitable. Who determines that it's unsuitable? So how do you negotiate around this language that feels like it's, and you and I do language, as I know many in the virtual, that feels so squishy?
And I think this is where the issue is. It is squishy. I mean, some of it isn't, you know. I think when we get into some of the, you know, I'm looking at this exalts evil. I mean, well, even that's squishy because, you know,
that's even squishy.
What does that really mean? But yeah, I mean, I think it is very vague, and as we saw in the news clip that you showed, because the language is very vague, you really don't know what the fine lines are.
Right. which could be
And
very intentional. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
no. Yeah, it is. There's very fine lines of what, when we're, sort of making that determination, and then who makes the determination, right?
Right.
So
Well, and I add here, when we're talking about protecting the children, I've written some pieces, and I'm always questioning whose children are we protecting. So when we have to mention the elephant in the room is the critical race theory that has brought so many people out of the woodworks, resisting what many can't even define. And I know that in my own state here, that was one of the platforms that certain people ran on, and actually are in positions now to determine a lot of what goes on in education here in Arizona. What were people protecting them from? That's what I want to figure out. So what is it the fear of? Well, we saw years ago, and I think you were in Arizona at the time, when there was this ban on ethnic studies, and it was allegedly because it was going to bring people together and they would uprise and overthrow the government. Now, in my lifetime, I can only recall one of those in recent memories. And I don't know that the people who were storming a certain capital in Washington were doing that because they had been in an ethnic studies class. Now, correct me if I'm wrong.
I wish I had something for you, Dr. Weston, but I will say, I remember being in high school, and the book The Outsiders was considered, was going to incite people to go and join gangs. And I mean, there was all kinds of, it was like behaviors that were contrary to what we understood at the time as being acceptable.
Right.
I don't think that I knew anyone who read The Outsiders or anything, or read J.D. Salinger, who ended up doing any of these things, or having, sort of any, whatever ended up happening to them, it was probably not J.D. Salinger and The Outsider that drove it. But, I think it speaks, though, to the power of the book. Books are very powerful. And you made the comment about a book saving people's lives.
Yeah.
We often have these conversations about people speaking about books that they have read, not just banned ones, but many books that they've encountered that have been really critical in their self-development, their future development. And so it just goes to show you that, the book, any container of ideas can be very powerful.
Well, but then at the same time, I'm looking at this through this historical lens of the ways in which literacy, being able to read and write, was forbidden for women and people of color. And I'm thinking, literacy then became a way of sort of liberating, as Frederick Douglass talks about, but it certainly didn't mean that racial discrimination went away. And then having, as you point out, Michelle, of the poll tax, being able to read and write. So there was power in that. And when people started to become literate, to be able to read and write, then they could write their own stories. And that became fearful also, because you could read alternatives to the quote unquote master narrative that was being fed, digested, and ingested. So therein lies part of the fear, is that people's minds become liberated. We may be able to shackle people's bodies, but when it comes to the mind has a kind of interiority that can be its own liberator. And I think that's probably what it is. But you're right, it's deliberately trying to sort of censor ideas and creativity. I'm wondering at this point, though, is it possible to have a conversation about book banning that is apolitical? So
I think at one time we used to have those types of conversations. And I'll just say, we all of us, we as humans, in our social categorizations, or that we politicize things. So, book banning, like anything else, gets politicized. But, there was a time when, 3 or 4 people could walk in and challenge the same book, all for very different reasons. And
For the
They could be from very different walks of life. I'll just take, something like Harry Potter, for example.
that was mentioned in the chat. Yes.
For Harry Potter, there were people that would challenge Harry Potter for some of the obvious reasons, because I think we had Exalts Evil was on your list. But someone else would challenge Harry Potter because they didn't feel like it was representative. Where were the wizards of color? Now we have people who will challenge Harry Potter because of J.K. Rowling's controversial positions around gender identity. And so in that way, any book is going to may have many things that people find quote unquote offensive or challenging. And so, but it just seems like, I think what we see happening, and I think it's just part of the, we're becoming a very polarized society right now. It feels like there's sort of this, maybe more one-sided than the other sort of spin around book banning. But if we look at it historically, books have been banned for a variety of different reasons, and all of those people may have had very different agendas.
Well, and I'm thinking of that children's book that I use in my N-word course. It's called 10 Little N-Word Boys, N-Word Girls. That was not banned. And I'm glad that nobody burned those, because I use those as artifacts now. Then I think of things like Song of the South, those things that were so normalized when they presented people who look like us in very, very unflattering, dehumanizing ways were often normalized. So there are ways in which this banning, as you say, has historical roots far deeper than where we are right this minute. And I do remember a quote in doing the research that said something to the effect of most classics are banned somewhere. And a good library, as I think you said, will have something that will offend everybody. Talk to me about that concept, because we think of librarians as gatekeepers, like teachers and parents and community groups. But a good library, talk to me about that, librarian.
We're not going to have everything. We're not going to have everything, but in the curation, when we curate, I think we talked a little bit about this idea of our library is neutral.
Right. Yes.
And my position has always been that if you put a car in neutral, it's not going anywhere, right? So yes, these institutions, or the folks that are in these institutions making decisions, they may be nonpartisan decisions, but they are making curatorial decisions about content. And generally, yes, the way that happens is often you will find opposing viewpoints. And of course, there are tons of them. And you may find that, if you may get us to a section of the library and you're like, yep, this is my section, and walk 3 feet down and be aghast at what is on the shelf. And that's absolutely perfectly fine, right? Because some person coming down the other direction will be in that same section and be perfectly satisfied and go to your section and feel the same exact way.
Right. So this is sort of, and that might explain why there are no universal quote unquote policies on book banning, because this notion of book banning, and there's a piece that I'll reference in resources that we'll give to those who registered, a brief history of banned and challenged books. There are no universal policies for the exact reason that you just pointed out here.
No, and I think the thing is, most of the banning, happens at a very local level, right? So, it's your local library, it's your local school district. And so, there's, that we have structured, because we're thinking about banning, which is, in per the definition, the government entity or some other entity that actually does the actual banning. These things are very hyper local. And so, it's almost, I'm not going to say it's impossible. And that, yes, there have been challenges even to local jurisdictions attempts to ban certain materials that have made their way up to, the Supreme Court or the Circuit Court and have been, either if they haven't been fully overturned, there have been guardrails, put on them. So yeah, you might not put it on your reading list in the school district, but it should be on the library shelves. Yeah.
Okay, let's move to the next slide and talk about the rights of students. I know that in the work that I do on the N-word, and when it's particularly in the classroom, and teachers will be called on it, particularly teachers of color, they'll be called on it. And then what they turn to is like, this is my academic freedom. This is how I need to teach the text. And what we forget about in conversations about that are the rights of the students to learn without interruption. I think there's a parallel conversation that can happen when we talk about the rights of students. And I want to highlight a couple of ideas here that I think are critical to this conversation, that we're not universalizing this banning because different things happen at different levels. So public school students enjoy First Amendment protection depending on the type of expression and their age. Constitutional provisions safeguarding individual rights place limits on government and its agents, but not on private institutions or individuals. I'll just read these and then we'll sort of tease out some of these. The First Amendment rights of students speak of students in public, elementary, secondary, and higher education institutions. Private schools are not government actors, and thus there is no state action trigger. There are differences between students in public elementary and secondary schools and those in public colleges and universities. The latter group of students, presumably more mature, do not present disciplinary problems that educators encounter in grade school and high school, so courts have deemed it reasonable to treat the two groups differently. And then finally, the different level of speech protection for students in institutions of higher education who are generally 18 years or older and thus legally adults is evident from several cases. Students on college and university campuses enjoy more academic freedom than secondary school students. So what do you have to add to this in terms of the rights of the students?
Well, I have to be honest with you, Dr. Lester. I am not a teacher.
Okay.
This is sort of out of my scope a little bit.
Okay.
But we in the library world, we do talk about the freedom to read,
right,
and the freedom to access reading materials.
That's what I'm looking at. Yeah.
And this aligns in many ways with that. So I really don't know if I have too much to add on the specifics.
Okay. We'll just make these distinctions because we are talking about different worlds in the same way that when we're talking about when we're talking about student resource officers, those in some schools are not necessarily in other schools. They're typically minoritized schools or schools with minoritized communities of students versus those that are richer and more, shall we say, capacitated. But there are differences. I know, for example, at one point, as a person who teaches African-American literature, there was this brief movement to ban anything at the college level that had anything to do with sex. Does that sound familiar? And then I looked over the things that I teach in my literature class, and I could find very few things that didn't have some aspect of sex. Let's say Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of an American slave. I don't even know how you could teach that because so much of that was about sexual violence. And the procreating that populated plantations. So there was a way in which it was impossible to find an alternative to that. How do you find an alternative to some of the books that we teach, say, Beloved, which is specifically about a rape, or Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Birds Sing? How do you find alternatives to that? Fortunately, that particular bill died, and we still have a certain kind of luxury. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. Those opposed to book banning and censorship go back to emphasize the students' rights to receive and express ideas. And I'll just mention this in case you want to look this up. The Supreme Court and Board of Education, Island Trees Union Free School District versus Pico 1982 ruled 5-4 that public schools can bar books that are pervasively vulgar. There again is that language. The vaguer the language, the easier it is to censor. or not right for the curriculum, but they cannot remove books simply because they dislike the ideas contained in those books. That's a pretty good distinction, that they're pervasively vulgar, however vague that is, but not simply because you don't like it. Now, my sense is you can always find a reason not to like it and then come up with an argument against it. The court's decision, however narrow, applies only to the removal of books from school library shelves. Is that a distinction worth making in this conversation here, Cyndee? And you're on mute. Are you having a sound problem? Okay, all right. Let's go to the next slide then. And let's see, why we might argue against, because even the very nature of presenting this particular event, it states a position, although it's a position that Project Humanity's held, which is trying to look at the humanity of all folks, It is not faith-based. But there is and you know this person, Jason Reynolds, and this is one of the reasons that he has cited why he is on this mission to make sure that there are diverse books out there. And it's about the importance of seeing oneself in literature. And he says, as a Black person, when I walk in a room, I spot the Black people in that room. It makes me feel safe. And when I spot those Black folks, I can see everybody much more clearly. I'm open in a different way. I think that's a human thing, and it's no different when it comes to literature. He is a young adult author, and he talks about the ways in which seeing oneself. Let's talk about that notion. Do you have some sound now?
I have got sound.
You got sound of seeing oneself. How is that notion of seeing oneself? How important is that, and why does that threaten other people?
I think one of the ways we talk about this often in we need diverse books, as a big proponent of making sure that there are characters that have a very active dog near me right now.
Okay.
Trying to unplug me and do other things. Obviously seeing oneself is super important. It's very empowering to see oneself, to recognize oneself. And as you said earlier, narrative is super important. Telling our own stories, seeing our lived experience is very empowering. And so, when we don't see ourselves, then, I, in addition to doing library work, also do futures work. So I do strategic foresight. And what's very interesting to me is people who maybe haven't had engagements in which people have actually asked them to think about what their future self is like, find it very difficult to think about a future. Because even just asking someone, what do you want to be when you grow up? But when you don't see yourself as portrayed in a book as something like what is possible, then your possibilities are diminished in some way, right? So it does become very important to know that not only is your existence validated, but your possibilities are validated. And when that doesn't happen, then, it really is diminishing. It doesn't give you hope. It doesn't give you a reason to thrive and to carry on.
Right. Well, and I love how he clarifies here. He says, we can't just have one book. We have to have lots of books. There's no books that's going to capture everything. But he says, I felt like the books that he read were disconnected from his reality. I felt like books were almost in some passive way judging me for being who I was, simply by erasing me from the idea, like from the canon in and of itself. And I know that when I saw my first Black book, I read Ntozake Shange and Zora Neale Hurston, and I heard that, and I somehow felt like I was valued in a different way and acknowledged. And I want to pause here because this is a Vital Voices where we invited people to share, but I wanted to sort of at least put this in the context of being our human selves and being able to see ourselves and have ourselves validated. Doesn't mean that other people have to validate you, but there's something uplifting about acknowledging our presence. So I know that at least one person brought something to share. This is your opportunity to share a connection in a 2 to 3, we're going to say 2-minute share to our banned book subject tonight. That's what makes it different from just having us talk as the quote expert and facilitator. Did we have any people who want to share or brought things to share? And then our tech people will, Marlena, one of our Humanity 101 founders. Are you there, Marlena? Is Marlena in the audience? Okay, did someone else bring something to share while we wait for Marlena? I think Marlena has. Okay, Sandra, please share. Oh, let's go. There's Marlena, and then we'll come to Sandra. All right, Marlena.
Okay, well, you really covered so much ground. My mind was racing all over the place. Well, I will say, as many of us did, I did read Catcher in the Rye as a child, and I don't know if I was hiding the book or what, but my mother never got that one.
Okay.
But it's really odd. As an adult, my mother did get a book from me. It was a sexual book, and she never gave it back. And I'm like, well, hey, I'm an adult. What's up with this taking my books? And the only other thing, since our time is limited, someone had it in the chat. Charter schools, some people, we say in Arizona, because somebody said this to me. He said, because I was involved with SOS and we were trying to, that save our schools and trying to keep the money in public schools. And he was saying, oh, well, I don't like what they're teaching kids and quote unquote, that it was religious objections to what they were teaching in the schools. And he didn't like the books that were being allowed. And as a teacher, I remember, yes, there were some kids for religious reasons. Their parents didn't want them to read certain books. But, I feel like everybody does, kids should be able to be exposed and be able to read whatever they want to read. I mean, it's not going to harm you, at least not in my opinion, because I've read Huck Finn, Ladies Chatterley Lover, and I was, some of it is a little shocking, but
okay, but you survived. You survived.
Yeah.
You've been traumatized by it. Thank you, Marlena, for sharing that. And you come from this as from the perspective of one who has taught in public schools.
Right. And for the most part, it was only a few.
Right.
But now, it's way more people.
Right. Thank you. All right, Sandra, I see your hand there. You're muted. Unmute yourself, please. Could you unmute that person?
I got it. I finally got it. Okay. Well, I'm reading right now. I'm trying to read all the books on the list. So
book list.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Look at you being a rebel. Right. Okay.
But well, because I'm curious. I mean, I read A Wrinkle in Time years ago, so I'm rereading it. I taught from Dr. Seuss, Hop on Pop, really, and the Lorax. So I'm reading Judy Blume right now, Forever, and it's a little racy, and it's about high school students and their decision to have sex. But
that never happens in real life, does it?
But the book that I chose, I had put right away in the chat for you, was The Violent Conspiracy. And although the book is a novel, the author talks about that he had those experiences down south, being pulled over, highly educated, a violinist, and he did not see himself. He was a Black man who didn't see other violinists. They don't play classical music. So it was a beautiful and sad and eye-opening book.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned the book list, and somebody in the chat said, which book list are you referencing? Because there are lots of book lists out there.
There are, and what I learned from the Scottsdale Library up in Appaloosa, they had a display. I'm trying to read the ones that they had.
So a list of banned books? Is that what you're referencing? Okay.
Yeah. So but there's many lists.
There are many out there. There's like the 100 top banned books. In fact, I looked at one in preparation for this, and most of the books that I teach are on the banned book list. And I also teach these in Privilege and Bias, and I use children's books. And the books that are on that list are there, like I Am Jazz, which is one of the few picture books about transgender realities. There's another one called The Princess Boy, which is about trying to deconstruct. Well, you know this, Cyndee, you can pipe in, you're a librarian. The Princess Boy, that's on the list. What's the
and
Princess?
What about Tango Makes Three?
And Tango Makes Three, yes. What's threatening about those, Cyndee?
Well,
to some people,
I mean, there are conversations that, some people just don't want to have.
Okay.
I think that's primarily it. They see, it challenges maybe a particular perspective of how they see the world and want to see the world,
Okay.
And so, and acknowledges, that maybe the world's changing in ways that they may not necessarily be prepared for, and and may not have yet figured out where they fit into that world. So instead of like doing the work of figuring out, it's just better that we not talk about it.
Just stick your head in the sand, because I seem to recall The Princess Boy is about a little brown boy who loves princess outfits and he wants to dress up, and there's nothing in there about the little boy's sexuality. It just says he likes to dress up in a princess, if I'm recalling. That's the adults making the connection between, wanting to paint nails, wanting to wear a tutu, and putting it on the book. The book doesn't do that. All it says is this little boy wants to wear a tutu. Why is that an issue? What is threatening about that? Okay. And if he does, has a sexual identity that's not heteronormative, why is that a problem? How is that a problem? If we talk about these agendas, there was a way in which we are fed certain things without our awareness around race, around family, around sexuality. That was an agenda. An agenda is when we start talking about, having founding fathers who actually found nothing, and they actually own people as chattel slaves. So those are the narratives that we want to keep away from people, but we can't even talk about MLK today and his legacy if we are going to just sugarcoat and, treat him as somebody said Santa Claus, who didn't see color and didn't see difference, because that's not MLK. So that's why this is important. Did someone else bring something to share? Yes, Betsy. Yep, you're muted, Betsy.
There. Okay. Well, I taught in the 1960s, early 70s, and I couldn't find any of the books I wanted to teach kids about people who weren't white. And I scrounged the libraries for that. But what I found interesting just recently is, a lot of the people who are worried about the books and the critical race theory and all that want us to go back to the classics. Well, my book club is reading a book called The Last of the Wine about Greek society, Greek democracy. Those issues are front and center. And I don't think I was a history major. I don't think these people have a clue about history.
Right, right. Well, that's also interesting. When the ethnic studies came here in Tucson, one of the questions that I raised in a piece was, I wonder if those people ever sat in an ethnic studies class, because there's nothing in an ethnic studies class that says anything about rebelling against the government. If anything, it's about what Jason Reynolds just talked about, is seeing oneself validated and not pretending. And this is where I think connects with your comment earlier, Cyndee, about the censorship or erasure by omission, is that if you don't see yourself in these books, then you wonder how and why does your life matter? And I'm pleased to hear that you said, Betsy, that we can find more books now, but you still have to look for books that are not heteronormative. You still have to look for books that are not, about middle class folks in a way that's not disparaging people who are not middle class. So it's still a bit of a treasure hunt, although we can find those books. And even when we find those books, it doesn't mean that those books necessarily are perfect. Those books can still be critiqued, but those books do validate these lives. And I said earlier, every banned book is a book that potentially saves someone's life. And I know at least one person, Michelle Michaels, mentioned being able to see herself in some of the books that were countering sort of heteronormativity there. So that's the ways in which these book bans can not only censor lives, but erase people altogether. Anybody else in the chat indicate that they wanted to chat, or indicate they wanted to chat, or to share something about a banned book experience or a piece from a banned book?
I have a piece I'd like to share.
Okay. All right, Rachel.
Okay. So the piece that I want to share is an excerpt from a banned book by Sandra Cisneros. It's called The House on Mango Street. It's a very good book. I love it a lot. And this is a quick excerpt from her, I believe it's chapter 13 on this, called The Monkey Garden, chapter 5. So just as a kind of background, she's talking about how there's this kind of overrun garden where like a family who used to own a pet monkey was, and now they've left. And she talks about her experiences in that garden. So she says, this is where I wanted to die and where I tried one day, but not even the monkey garden would have me. It was the last day I would go there. Who was it that said I was getting too old to play games? Who was it I didn't listen to? I only remember that when others ran, I wanted to run too, and down through the monkey garden as fast as the boys, not like Sally, who screamed if her stockings got muddy. I said, Sally, come on, but she wouldn't. She stayed on the curb talking to Tito and his friends. Play with the kids all you want, she said. I'm staying here. She could be stuck up like that if she wanted to. So I just left. It was her own fault too. When I got back, Sally was pretending to be mad, something about the boys having stolen her keys. Please give them back to me, she said, punching the nearest one with a soft fist. They were laughing. She was too. It was a joke I didn't get. I wanted to go back with the other kids who were still jumping on cars, still chasing each other through the garden, but Sally had her own game. One of the boys invented the rules. One of Tito's friends said, you can't get your keys back unless you kiss us. And Sally pretended to be mad at first, but she said yes. It was that simple. I don't know why, but something inside of me made me want to throw a stick. Something wanted to say no when I watched Sally going into the garden with all of Tito's buddies grinning. It was just a kiss. That's all. A kiss for each one, so she said. Only how come I felt angry inside, like something wasn't right? Sally went behind that old blue pickup truck to kiss the boys to get her keys back. And I ran up 3 flights of stairs to where Tito lived. His mother was ironing shirts. She was sprinkling water on them from an empty pop bottle and smoking a cigarette. Your son and his friend stole Sally's keys, and now they're not going to give them back unless she kisses them right now, and they're making her kiss them. I said, all out of breath by running 3 flights of stairs. She said, not looking up from her ironing, that's all? What do you want me to do? Call the cops? I looked at her for a long time, but couldn't think of anything to say and ran back down to the garden. So one of the reasons why I love that that excerpt, we read this actually in my AP class in high school. And one of the things that I remember us talking about was how Sandra Cisneros sets up this idea of setting and characterizes her characters and how you can learn so much from them, even with this like small like excerpt. And one of the things that I said when they were saying like, who like, what can you tell about these characters? And I immediately go, oh, I think they're probably Latino, like my family. Because this lady saying like, what do you want me to do? Call the cops while she's like smoking a cigarette and ironing. I can think of my family who's Hispanic and my family living in an apartment complex. And I remember when I said that, people were like, what do you mean about that? I was at a predominantly white school and people were like, you can't tell like what socioeconomic status someone is just by reading that. And I'm like, no, you can. Like she does that with her writing. And so, yeah, I had the opportunity to tell Sandra Cisneros about that moment. And she's like, she's like, well, did you tell them that in the moment? I was like, no, I didn't. And she was like, well, you should have.
Well, thank you. That is further validation on so many levels to be able to talk to the author about that too. Thank you, Rachel. The book that I shared at my first book banned book event last fall, was The Bluest Eye. And I have taught this book forever. It is my favorite Toni Morrison book. It's her first book that she wrote, and it's about a little Black girl. Well, it's about many things. The center of it is a little Black girl who wants to be white. And here's just a segment of that. It says, it occurred to Pecola, she's the little girl, some time ago, that if her eyes, those eyes that held the pictures and knew the sights, if those eyes of hers were different, that is to say beautiful, she herself would be different. Her teeth were good. At least her nose was not big and flat like some of those who were thought so cute. If she looked different, beautiful, maybe Charlie, her dad, would be different, and Mrs. Breedlove, her mother, too. Maybe they'd say, why, look at pretty-eyed Pecola. We mustn't do bad things in front of her. Pretty eyes, pretty blue eyes, big blue pretty eyes. Run, Jip, run. Jip runs, Alice runs. Alice has blue eyes. Jerry has blue eyes. Jerry runs, Alice runs. They run with their blue eyes. 4 blue eyes, 4 pretty blue eyes. Blue sky eyes, blue like Miss Forrest. Blue blouse eyes, morning glory blue eyes. Alice and Jerry, blue storybook eyes. Each night, without fail, she prayed for blue eyes. Fervently, for a year she had prayed. And although somewhat discouraged, she was not without hope. To have something so wonderful as that happen would take a long, long, long time. Now, that is a really powerful and disturbing book. There are many disturbing things, but what people gravitate toward is the rape at the end. And I'm sorry to be a spoiler, but there is sexual violence, and the way in which Toni Morrison writes that is really disturbing. There's incest, but there's also self-hatred. And I don't know that we would censor that, would we? Cyndee, what have you had any experiences with people talking about banned books in The Bluest Eye? I mean, it looks like everything Toni Morrison has written is banned.
Yes, and I, obviously, and that's one of those books that I mentioned where you can get multiple people who will want to ban that book for different
reasons. Okay.
The sexual content on one side, but then the portrayal of sort of what can be perceived as anti-Blackness to some people, or the rejection of one's Blackness. So you can get, 2 very different issues, offenses, if you will, for something like that.
Which to me could be the success of the book. If it's offending everybody for very different reasons, that means that people need to read it. What's really sad is how people, are offended by stuff they don't even know what it is. Ask people who are most up in arms about critical race theory, what is it? What is it? What is it you're afraid of? And first of all, nobody's teaching it, Now, if it's about anti-racism, and remember we thought that there was this sort of shift this sort of shift of perspectives after George Floyd's murder, and now we seem to totally flip-flop. So we can't even talk about historical stuff. That's what I said today. Wouldn't Dr. King be banned when he talked about anti-militarism, when he talked about Black self-love, when he points out in the I Have a Dream speech, Negroes have not gotten what America has promised? Negroes, he didn't say everybody, he said Negroes. And then in that speech that nobody talks about, the other America, where he talks about some people living in the land of opportunity and others in despair, or where he says, you know, riot is the language of the unheard. That's the King that not many people really want to deal with. And if they read that, we probably wouldn't be reading King this time next year. I don't know. I'm just speculating. Anybody else come to share? All right. Yes. Oh, okay. You giving me a hands up, LaChaz? Okay. All right. Anybody else come to share? Because we want to give you some action items too. All right. We want to give you some action items. Yeah.
Okay. I want to go back to one or two of things that you mentioned. I have also taught Toni Morrison and the Bluest Eye. And of course, there is that rape scene, but there's so many levels. Yes. But once again, and you know, my concern always, just in terms of when we talk about the really great books, you know, we're talking about Hemingway, we're talking about Faulkner, we're talking, you know, all of that. Mark Twain. Going back to, you know, Fitzgerald. Yes. So they are all on the list there. But I brought with me, because we were discussing in another group, James Baldwin, the Giovanni's Room.
Okay.
And of course that has been banned, and so has his, you know, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and just a number of things, you know, Baldwin himself. And even in terms of Native Son, the banning there. And then of course you've got the Ellison, you've got the Invisible Man, all of those, what we would consider, you know, excellent writing. When we look to, again, the integrity of the written word and what they are doing there. Right. This is from the Baldwin, and this is Giovanni's Room. And I just want to share this with you because it is really understated. And that is the beauty of it. But once again, in terms of the interpretation and what I don't want my children to know. But here it is. This is David, and he is going to Giovanni's room for the first time. And of course, he is saying that he is not gay, that certainly he does not have these tendencies, but he is certainly attracted to Giovanni. So they are in the room for the first time. Giovanni has invited him back. He doesn't, David is going to be kicked out of his room because he hasn't paid the bill, etc. But here it is, just very understated, but beautiful in the concept. And this is Baldwin once again. He locked the door, and this is Giovanni locking the door. They're going in for the first time. He locked the door behind us. And then for a moment in the gloom, we simply stared at each other with dismay, with relief, and breathing hard. I was trembling. I thought, if I do not open the door at once and get out of here, I am lost. But I knew I could not open the door. I knew it was too late. Soon it was too late for both of us to do anything but moan and moan again. He pulled me against him, putting himself into my arms as though he were giving me himself to carry, and slowly pulled me down with him to that bed. There we were, with everything in the screaming, my saying no, yet the sum of me sighing and saying yes. Just beautifully written, again, understated, but certainly there. And then
there's nothing understated about that, man. There's nothing understated about it. And also, you're not reading this.
But understated in the sense that there is no description of what is taking place.
Right, exactly.
You know, this is simply love. In other words, well, attraction, it's love. It is any two persons coming together, pulling one together down to a bed. So
Right.
yes, understated, but
Yeah.
it is what you want to read
Yeah.
into it.
Yes.
That is,
Gotcha.
going back to the fear that we mentioned. The other thing in this book that I thought that was interesting too, and I put a little hold here. This is when David, and of course he is trying to be with Hella, and we know all of the names always have meaning there, the characters' names, but he's trying to be with Hella. And finally he gives up and he leaves her one early morning while she's sleeping. And he listened to this. I roamed all the bars of that glittering town. And of course he is in Paris. I roamed all the bars of that glittering town. And at the end of the first night, blind with alcohol and grim with lust, I climbed the stairs of a dark hotel and in company with a sailor. It turned out late the next day that the sailor's leave was not yet ended and that the sailor had friends. We went to visit them. We stayed all night. We spent the next day together and the next day and the next day too. On the final night of the sailor's leave, we stood drinking together in a crowded bar. We faced the mirror. I was very drunk. I was almost penniless. In the mirror, suddenly I saw Hella's face. I thought for a moment that I had gone mad, and I turned. She looked very tired and drab and small. For a long time, we said nothing to each other. I felt the sailor staring at me and then at both of us. Hasn't she got the wrong bar, he said. Hella looked at him. She smiled and she said, well, not just the wrong bar, but the wrong man.
Well, that should be on our reading list. That should be on our reading list as well. I can tell we got another Baldwin fan in the audience out there. Let's get Rachel to the slide that says action items, because we've talked about what the issues are, the definitions, and the foundation. I want to know what people are already doing relative to banned books issue in your space that you inhabit. What are you doing? Put that in the chat, please. And then I want that slide of action items to come up, please. The action items, the next one.
Author Ta-Nehisi
The next, no, the next one, please. The action items. Thank you. All right, so tell us in the chat what you're doing relative to banned books and the issue as it's discussed in your particular communities. And here are some suggestions of what people may want to do if you want to be involved in these conversations. So is anybody putting things in the chat? Stay informed, first of all. Well, let's say Banned Book Week occurs as an opportunity for readers to voice censorship concerns, celebrate free expression, and show their communities the importance of intellectual freedom. Here's what you can do to fight censorship: keep books available in libraries and promote the freedom to read. And that's fundamentally, I mean, that's as political as we get. We want people to see themselves. That to me seems the ultimate when we talk about justice and humanity and diversity. But stay informed. Attend a Banned Books Week program. It was my first time last October, and it was quite transformative. That's one of the reasons we're doing this. Stream a Banned Book Week webinar. Organize your own Banned Book Week program. Participate in a Stand for Ban virtual readout. Write a letter to a favorite banned or challenged author. Submit content that address censorship and banned books to the Intellectual Freedom blogs. You can Google that, Intellectual Freedom blog. Perform a play about the freedom to read. Proclaim Banned Book Week at your local library. Stock up on the Banned Book Week material. Do what some people are doing here, like tonight, is reading the ones on that banned book. That's another thing. And I think Ta-Nehisi Coates says that when he says his books have been banned and it caused more people to buy the book and read it. So there's a way in which banning also makes people go out and say, well, why is it banned? Write a letter to the editor. Brush up on your banned book history. Help spread the word, but speak out. exercise your reading rights and join the Freedom to Read Foundation. Cyndee, what can you add to this conversation about what people may already be doing and what else they can do to ensure that people have the freedom to read? And the freedom to read is also the freedom to have written diverse lives and diverse perspectives.
Understanding not just, all of these things, but also understanding that just like people can, take actions to their library board of trustees or their school districts, even if you don't have a child in that district or in your district, you may not be a parent at the time or a grandparent. But you are a taxpayer, and so you have a right to be heard just as much as anyone else.
Right.
And so if you want to make sure that book stays on the shelf, or just making sure that you're engaged, and I think paying attention is really important. And then speak, as you said, speaking up. I kind of giggled when you said sometimes a band will drive people to be more
buy the book.
interested in drive curiosity. I've had this experience myself
Right.
with certain things that, as soon as you say don't, people go, oh, well, why not? And they drive their curiosity. But yeah, being informed, realizing and recognizing that your voice needs to be heard in some occasions is really important.
Well, and I'd add to it, if you're on the side of those who want to ban books, I think the question has to be looked at from the perspective of kind of glancing in the mirror and saying, why am I wanting this book banned? What is there about this book that's making me uncomfortable? And why is it that just because I don't want to read it, do I not want somebody else to read it? So that's an important question, because how we feel may not necessarily be how others. And one of the many, many points that you made tonight, which is really important to me, is you can ban something for very different reasons. You can ban it for very different reasons. Cyndee, I can't thank you enough for participating in this conversation. I've looked forward to it for months now. I appreciate your perspective. Please know that you are forever a supporter and enthusiast of Project Humanities from way back. We tonight have had lots and lots of references in the chat to books people have read, have talked about. We will be sending out a follow-up email to those who registered, even to those who were unable to attend. So it'll give you some of the sources. So if you have particular sources that you think would be really helpful, Cyndee, from your perspective, we'll add those to that follow-up communication. But thank you, and continue to be our friend and to help celebrate the good work that I think Project Humanities is doing to challenge the status quo. And this is but one of those conversations. All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lester, and the Project Humanities team. I've been a supporter and follower and since the beginning, and I'm very proud of the work that you all continue to do. It is so important. So
yes,
thank you all so much for
well, we got another 10 years ahead of us, so we've already started one. As you sign out, notice their feedback forms, so please, well, it says keep a lookout in your inbox for feedback forms, because we do like constructive criticism. We'd like to know that there is an opportunity for us to hear your voice. Please sign our pledge, our Humanity 101 pledge. Remember, I brought that up because everything we said tonight is fundamentally about trying to keep humanity at the center of our thinking and our actions. But only if that humanity can be connected to compassion and empathy and forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, and reflection, and not in some dessert sort of way, in a main course sort of way. So if you really enjoyed our conversation tonight, go tell somebody about it. Go tell somebody about the work that Project Humanities is doing. We are alternating between, well, not alternating, but we're doing both hybrid and virtual and in-person events. Go to our website, look at what we've got coming up. We've got all kinds of film screenings and other conversations, from birthing justice to, I can't even remember. We've got so many, but they're there on our events page. They are free. And again, we will try to be doing these regularly so that we can keep you informed about where you can go to have conversations that not only challenge, but also enlighten. Again, the resources will be coming in an email, and the feedback forms will pop up once you sign out. So thank you, and Happy New Year. And if I'll ask Cyndee and the rest of the Project Humanities team to stay on for a group shot, that would be fantastic. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Brooklyn, New York. Happy MLK Day. Listen, learn, talk, listen, and connect. Thank you. All right. All right.